Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a conqueror, but with a few accidents of fate so bizarre that even the medieval church had to pause and say, okay, that's weird. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's hazy little journey together. The year was 1145, when England was still figuring out how shoes worked, and everyone was named either William, Henry, or something that sounded like a sneeze. In the city of Winchester, two noble families celebrated the birth of baby boys, both named William. Because apparently, originality was a sin back then. These weren't just any Williams. They were mirror images of each other. Born within weeks, raised in the same town, trained by the same swordmaster, and, according to one monk, even baptized with the same slightly stolen holy water. Their families were proud, though it's unclear whether they were proud of their sons, or simply proud of remembering which William was theirs at dinner. As adults, the Williams remained eerily similar. Same shoulder-length haircut, the medieval default, same scar on the left cheek from the same jousting accident because coordination wasn't genetic, and the same wife's name, Alice. Because back then, even romance lacked creativity. The monks chronicling all this insisted it was a sign from God, which is what medieval people called anything that made them uncomfortable, but too lazy to explain. One bright spring morning, both Williams went hunting, in different forests, at the exact same hour. Each spotted a deer, lowered his lance, charged forward, and immediately impaled himself on it. Same wound, same position, same day. It's hard to know what's more impressive, the odds or the sheer athleticism required to lose to your own weapon. The news hit Winchester like divine slapstick. 2 funerals were held in the same church, both led by priests named Thomas, both attended by widows named Alice, both of whom fainted at the same verse of the same hymn. Chroniclers didn't know whether to call it tragic or efficient. The bishop declared it proof that God's hand moves in mysterious ways. Sure, mysterious, or just slightly sarcastic. The locals started calling them the Twin Williams, though the idiot brothers who invented Darwinism might have been more accurate. To this day, historians can't explain how it happened, but personally I suspect divine boredom. Because if you were God in 1145, watching endless peasants farm turnips, you'd probably spice things up too. It was the year 1170, and Canterbury Cathedral was the kind of place where miracles, politics, and gossip shared the same pew. Monks were chanting, candles were flickering, and somewhere deep inside, fate was clearing its throat. During evening vespers, as the choir sang their usual hymn, something in the key of eternal suffering, one monk suddenly froze mid-verse. His name, according to the chronicles, was Brother Edmund, though given medieval spelling, it might have been Edmond, or just Guy who panicked during prayer. Without warning, Edmund whispered, "He is dead." Everyone stopped singing, which, in a medieval monastery, was basically a war crime. The prior glared at him like he'd just questioned the Virgin Mary's cooking. "Who?" someone asked. And Edmund, apparently now the spokesman for the supernatural, replied, "Our Archbishop." Minutes later, a messenger burst through the cathedral doors, out of breath and covered in horse sweat, shouting that Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, had just been murdered by King Henry's knights. Inside the same cathedral, the monks went pale. They had literally been singing in the choir while their boss was getting stabbed in the next room. Medieval acoustics were impressive, but not that impressive. Brother Edmund's prediction became an instant sensation. The monks called it divine revelation. The church called it evidence of holy favour. Everyone else quietly wondered if Edmund just had very thin walls and excellent hearing. Still, the story spread across England. pilgrims flocked to Canterbury to see where the monk who heard death once stood. Artists painted him with a golden halo. Ballads were written. And of course the church built a shrine, because nothing says mourning like selling tickets to it. Years later, another monk swore he heard voices before a fire broke out in the cathedral. By then, the abbot had a rule. No more holy predictions during Vespers. They were bad for morale and insurance rates. Modern historians argue it was coincidence, a chilling, perfectly timed coincidence. But personally, I think Brother Edmund just had one of those sixth senses all introverts possess, the ability to detect when something truly awkward is about to happen. And in medieval England, that was basically every day. Italy, 1350. The Renaissance was still warming up, and most artists were busy painting saints who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. But in the city of Modena, one painter stood out. Tommaso di Modena, a man so talented, so ahead of his time, that he accidentally invented prophetic art. A full century before the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, Tommaso painted a mural of monks wearing strange bird-beaked masks. At the time, nobody questioned it. Artists back then could paint an angel wrestling a fish, and people would just nod respectfully. But 100 years later, when the plague arrived, doctors began wearing the exact same masks. Long-nosed, hollow-eyed, nightmare fuel with straps. A look Tommaso had already plastered across a church wall. Modern historians say it's coincidence. Medieval people said it was sorcery. Personally, I think Tommaso just had one of those unsettling talents for predicting misery. You know, the kind of guy who paints a boat right before a flood and says, "I don't know, I just felt like it." Back then, plague doctors stuffed herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges into those masks, believing they filtered out the disease. In reality, it just made them smell slightly better while dying. Tommaso's mural, however, looked almost identical, even down to the herbs tucked in the beak. When people noticed the resemblance a century later, panic ensued. Pilgrims came from all over Italy to stare at the painting, convinced it was a divine warning. The church called it a miracle. The local priests called it deeply unsettling, especially since the mural was located right next to the cloister dining hall. For a while, Tommaso's painting was treated like a holy artifact. Monks prayed to it, villagers left offerings, and one abbot swore the eyes of the masked monks moved slightly every full moon. Spoiler, they didn't. The candlelight just flickered. But medieval people never let physics ruin a good haunting. Sadly, Tommaso died before he could paint any follow-ups. Probably for the best. The last thing Europe needed was a fresco of people coughing blood, and a title like Work in Progress. Centuries later, art historians still debate it. Visionary? Coincidence? Or just a man who accidentally painted history's creepiest trailer for the apocalypse? Whatever the truth, Tommaso di Modena remains the only artist whose work went viral 100 years after release. The year was 1346, and Europe was once again holding its favourite recurring event, the 100 Years' War. Somewhere in the chaos, King John of Bohemia decided that being blind shouldn't stop him from fighting. Because in medieval times there was no concept of bad idea, only hold my chalice. John had lost his sight years earlier due to disease, but that didn't stop him from insisting on leading his troops into the Battle of Crécy. His knights tried to talk him out of it, probably with sentences like, "Sire, you can't see the enemy," to which John allegedly replied, "Neither can they once I'm done." It was a great speech, right up until he tied his horse to his knight's reins and ordered them to charge. You can picture it. 5 horses galloping into the fog of battle, tied together like the world's deadliest friendship bracelet. Chroniclers say they fought bravely. Personally, I think they just couldn't stop. When the dust settled, the entire squad was found dead, still tied together, looking like a medieval cautionary tale titled, "Why Helmets Aren't Everything." For most people, that would have been enough of a lesson. But no. 200 years later, history apparently decided it liked the bit too much to let it go. In 1546, at the same battlefield, another nobleman, a French commander named Charles de Montpensier, also partially blind, also in denial, repeated the stunt. Same field, same idea, same result. His last words were reportedly, "for glory," which is a noble way of saying, "this will not end well." To be fair, medieval commanders had a gift for turning recklessness into legend. It's why half of Europe's coats of arms feature lions, eagles, or something on fire. Still, two blind men charging into the same battle, centuries apart, feels less like destiny and more like a cosmic rerun. The chroniclers framed both deaths as noble. They called it chivalric courage. Everyone else quietly called it natural selection with extra steps. And so, King John's legacy became a medieval proverb. Follow your dreams. But maybe untie the horse first. Because nothing says heroic quite like being remembered for the same mistake. Twice. It was the year 1231, a peaceful summer in the Rhineland, which in medieval terms meant only one minor plague and a tolerable amount of heresy. In a small Benedictine abbey near Trier, a group of monks decided to celebrate their good fortune by writing a new manuscript. It was an illuminated text titled On the Protection of Holy Houses. The title alone already tempted fate. The manuscript was ornate, detailed, and, in the opinion of everyone involved, an absolute masterpiece. It contained prayers for divine protection against fire, flood, rats, and the occasional Viking. The abbot was so proud he insisted they add one more line to the final page, a flourish of holy confidence that read, "This library shall never burn, for it is blessed by the hand of God." If you just winced reading that, congratulations. You're smarter than the entire 13th century. 3 weeks later, lightning struck the abbey. Twice. The entire complex went up like a tinderbox soaked in faith. The monks managed to save very little, though witnesses noted one odd detail. When the smoke cleared, a single parchment remained intact, the very page that boasted divine fireproofing. The survivors called it a miracle. Personally, I'd call it divine sarcasm. For years afterward, the story spread through the monasteries of Europe as a cautionary tale. Never brag in ink, they'd say, for God is reading. Of course, this didn't stop anyone. Monks continued writing absurd claims in manuscripts for centuries. This book cannot be lost. These words are eternal. Brother Anselm definitely didn't steal my quills. Spoiler, all of those manuscripts burned too. The Church officially classified the incident as Mysterium Fidei, a mystery of faith, which is medieval Latin for "we have no idea, but let's not talk about it." Local peasants, on the other hand, were far less diplomatic. They called it God's practical joke. Ironically, a later copy of the same manuscript, carefully rewritten by surviving monks, also vanished in a fire 40 years later. At that point, even heaven seemed committed to the bit. So the moral, if there is one. In medieval Europe, never tempt the Almighty with confidence, especially not in writing. Because if there's one thing history proves, it's that divine retribution has excellent comedic timing. If there's one thing medieval Scandinavia was good at, it was dying dramatically. And nobody did it quite like King Olaf of Norway. Well, except for another King Olaf of Norway, who apparently thought dying the same way in the same valley 2 centuries later was good brand consistency. Let's start with Olaf I, the year 1030, the Battle of Stiklestad. Olaf was already famous for trying to convert Vikings to Christianity, which, as jobs go, was like trying to sell salad at a meat festival. His subjects revolted, obviously. During the fight, someone loosed an arrow that struck him directly in the throat. He died instantly, holy, heroic, and probably regretting the lack of a helmet neck guard. Fast forward about 200 years, and Norway's PR department must have run out of new material. Along comes Olaf IV, another king with ambition, faith, and apparently no awareness of history. He rides into the same valley, same battle, same date on the calendar, and you guessed it, takes an arrow to the throat. You almost have to respect the dedication to symmetry. The chroniclers went wild. They called it divine mystery, a heavenly sign. Others noted that the second Olaf had chosen to fight in the exact same location as his ancestor, which feels less like destiny and more like poor decision-making. Historians later discovered that his advisors warned him about the omen, which he ignored, claiming God decides the hour of every king's death. Apparently that hour was right about now. Afterwards, locals swore that the earth where both Olafs fell turned red, stained with royal blood, they said. Modern geologists later confirmed it was just iron-rich soil, but in the 1200s people didn't do science. They did superstition, and superstition paid better. Pilgrims started visiting the site to see the soil that bled, though it's unclear what they expected it to do. Wave? In the end, both Olafs were declared saints, because when your monarchy keeps dying the same way, you might as well market it. 2 kings, 2 arrows, 1 very sarcastic universe. It's almost as if the Norse gods, still salty about being replaced, decided to run the same practical joke twice, just to prove they still had good aim. Of all the things the medieval church excelled at, crusades, corruption, and complaining about astrology, digging up dead popes was not supposed to be one of them. But leave it to Pope Stephen VI, circa 897 AD, to look at a corpse and think, you know what this needs? A trial. Here's the setup. Stephen hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus, with the kind of passion usually reserved for medieval in-laws. So he ordered Formosus's body exhumed, 9 months dead, barely holding it together, dressed it in papal robes and propped it on a throne in front of a council. The Cadaver Synod, as historians now call it, was exactly as unhinged as it sounds. Stephen screamed accusations of blasphemy at the corpse. A deacon was appointed to defend Formosus, which might be history's worst job description. The body was found guilty, shocker, stripped of its robes and tossed into the Tiber River. Even for the 9th century, that was considered a bit much. But then came the strange part. Months later, Rome flooded. The river carried Formosus's bloated body right back into the city, perfectly preserved, and deposited it on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Locals called it a miracle. Stephen called it a problem. Not long after, Stephen went insane, or, as the Vatican politely put it, displayed excessive zeal. He was imprisoned by his own clergy and strangled in his cell. Coincidence? Maybe. But it didn't stop there. Fast forward about 200 years, and another pope, also named Stephen, died on the exact same day of the same month, while giving a sermon warning against repeating the sins of Pope Stephen. Divine irony doesn't get more punctual than that. Historians call it the curse of the Cadaver Synod. Personally, I call it heaven's version of a bad Yelp review. After that, Rome quietly agreed never to put another corpse on trial again, because even medieval Europe, land of relics and holy toenails, had limits. The lesson? Never dig up your predecessor just to prove a point. It turns out, in Rome, bad ideas don't die. They just come back 9 months later, waterlogged and smelling like divine revenge. In the summer of 1212, Europe collectively lost its mind, again, and decided to send children to reclaim the Holy Land. The logic went something like this. If hardened soldiers can't capture Jerusalem, maybe a bunch of unsupervised 12-year-olds can. It was an idea so breathtakingly stupid that only the Middle Ages could pull it off with a straight face. Led by a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes and a German kid named Nicholas, thousands of children claimed to have visions of angels telling them to march to the sea, where God himself would part the waters. Instead, they reached the Mediterranean, stared at it for a while, and realized it was, in fact, still a sea. That was the high point. Some turned back. Others boarded ships, generously provided by merchants who promised safe passage. Spoiler: those ships went straight to North Africa, where the kids were sold into slavery. The lucky ones made it home, older, wiser, and probably allergic to religious enthusiasm. The unlucky ones became a cautionary hymn. Fast forward 2 centuries, and Europe, apparently running low on creativity, decided to do it again. Another group of children, also claiming divine visions, set out along a nearly identical route. Same holy destination, same naive optimism, same lack of adult supervision. Predictably, they vanished too. Historians still argue whether it really happened twice, or whether medieval chroniclers got confused, which, considering their record-keeping, is entirely possible. Wait, are we still on the First Crusade? But what's undeniable is that the Children's Crusade became one of those stories Europe couldn't stop repeating. Part miracle, part mass delusion, and part tragic comedy. The Church, of course, insisted the children were inspired by faith. Everyone else suspected mass heat stroke. The weather that year was record hot, the roads swarmed with bandits, and apparently not one adult along the way stopped to ask, "Hey, should we maybe not let the orphans walk to Jerusalem?" If this story has a moral, it's that divine inspiration should always come with a chaperone. 2 crusades, 2 generations, 1 painfully avoidable mistake. And if history really does repeat itself, somewhere out there is a kid planning the 3rd one, probably with a GPORO. Some families pass down heirlooms. Others pass down land, titles, or shiny swords. But in the 13th century England, the Cliffords seemed determined to pass down only one thing: bad decision-making. Their story reads less like a noble lineage, and more like a cautionary comedy about hereditary stupidity. The first star of this tragic dynasty was Sir Walter de Clifford, who in 1203 managed to get himself accused of murder. The records don't say what happened, but given the era, it probably involved ale, horses, and someone getting insulted over whose saint was holier. When the royal guards came to arrest him, Walter panicked, fled town, and disappeared into legend, or at least into Wales, which in the 13th century was basically the same thing. Half a century later, history, and apparently God's sense of humour, repeated itself. Another Walter de Clifford, the grandson of the first, was accused of, you guessed it, murder. Same date, same town, same tavern, according to one suspiciously amused chronicler. When the sheriff showed up, this new Walter also bolted. The court notes simply say, fled and presumed guilty. At that point, even the scribes were rolling their eyes. You'd think someone in the family would have taken the hint, maybe changed the name, maybe stopped hanging around taverns on that specific day. But no. A century later, another Clifford, same name, same hairline of regret, was caught duelling a bishop's nephew, and once again vanished into the Welsh hills. Historians suspect the Cliffords weren't cursed, they were just consistently bad at hiding bodies. By the 1400s, doing a Clifford became local slang for running away from your own trial, which is saying something, because medieval England had a lot of things to run from. The family did eventually produce one success story, a Walter who actually made it to old age without committing homicide. Unfortunately, he died falling off his horse during a parade. No one was surprised. The chroniclers called the Cliffords an unfortunate lineage. Personally, I'd call them the Middle Ages answer to Darwin's theory. 3 centuries early, and 3 IQ points short. Some families leave behind castles. The Cliffords left behind a punchline. If there's one thing medieval Europe loved more than religion, it was fighting about it. And nowhere did theological debate get quite as flammable as Montségur, a fortress perched high in the Pyrenees and home to the Cathars, a group of monks who believed in peace, humility, and, unfortunately, living in a location that annoyed the Pope. By 1244, the Catholic Church had decided that peaceful heretics was an oxymoron. So, in a stunning display of Christian charity, they sent in an army. The siege lasted 10 months, during which both sides starved, froze, and loudly insisted that God was on their side. The Cathars claimed they didn't fear death, which, as it turned out, was convenient. When the fortress finally fell, about 200 monks were given a choice: convert to Catholicism or burn alive. They thought about it and said, We'll burn, thanks. Always nice when medieval theology doubles as a barbecue. Chroniclers claimed that as the monks were consumed by flames, the fire formed a perfect cross against the night sky. The crowd gasped. The inquisitors called it a sign from heaven. Personally, I think it was just a windy night. Here's where it gets strange. Exactly 100 years later, another fire broke out in the same valley. Same date, same spot, same oddly cross-shaped flames. Locals panicked. "The spirits of the Cathars are returning," cried some. "Our firewood was arranged poorly," cried others. Either way, no one rebuilt anything there for decades. Pilgrims began visiting the site, claiming to feel holy heat rising from the ground. Merchants sold sacred ashes that were, in all likelihood, just dirt with branding. Even the church got nervous. Always awkward when your own miracle looks like divine trolling. To this day, historians can't explain the second fire. Lightning, freak weather, divine symbolism. Take your pick. But what's clear is that Montségur became the medieval version of a cursed franchise. The sequel nobody asked for, but everyone watched burn. The moral? Never taunt fate with martyrdom. It apparently has an excellent memory and a passion for reruns. 2 centuries, 2 infernos, 1 very judgmental sky. If heaven really did send a message that night, it was probably this: you people have learned absolutely nothing. In 1356, London was doing what London always did best: smelling bad, overtaxing everyone, and pretending God liked the English more than the French. It was a damp spring evening at Westminster Abbey, and the monks were deep in their usual routine, chanting, repenting, and hoping no one noticed how much wine had vanished from the sacramental stockroom. That's when the ravens came. A whole flock of them, black, loud, and, according to one chronicler, unusually judgmental. They circled the towers, cawing in unison like a feathered jury. The monks froze. Birds in the abbey meant omens, and omens meant someone important was about to have a terrible week. One monk nervously joked, "Maybe they've just come for crumbs." The others didn't laugh. In medieval Europe, everything was a sign from heaven, especially if it scared you. That night, a storm hit. Thunder shook the abbey, lightning split the sky, and every raven vanished at once, which, to a monk's imagination, was basically the medieval version of jump-scare cinema. The next morning, a messenger arrived from Windsor. Prince Edward, the heir to the throne, was dead. The monks promptly fainted, prayed, and began recording what they now called the Prophecy of the Ravens. Word spread fast. Pilgrims flocked to Westminster to see where God's birds of warning had appeared. Painters even depicted them with glowing eyes, because subtlety wasn't a thing in the 14th century. The ravens were said to have returned every few decades, always before tragedy: plague, famine, or the latest royal scandal. 2 generations later, the same thing happened again. Ravens, storm, tragedy. This time it was Edward III's grandson dying suddenly. The monks didn't even wait for confirmation. They started fasting on the spot. The birds had clearly developed a flair for timing. By the 17th century, superstition turned into policy. King Charles II, terrified of losing both throne and luck, issued an official royal decree: let there always be ravens at the Tower of London. To this day they're still there, fed, pampered, and slightly smug. Historians call it tradition. I call it medieval emotional support animals. And somewhere in the heavens, a flock of ravens is still cackling, knowing that one bad day in 1356 earned them lifetime job security. Historians love to say that history repeats itself, but they usually mean metaphorically. In 1166, England decided to take that concept literally and restage one of its greatest hits, the Battle of Hastings, now with extra déjà vu. It had been exactly 100 years since William the Conqueror's famous victory in 1066, where an arrow found King Harold's eye and half of England found new landlords named de Something. A century later, Local lords in Sussex apparently thought, "You know what would be fun? Doing that again." And thus began the most unnecessary sequel in medieval history. The players, descendants of the original Norman invaders and the surviving Saxon families who still hadn't let it go. Both sides even brought leaders named, wait for it, William, because England, in its proud tradition of name recycling, simply couldn't resist. The fight started over a land dispute, which is medieval code for someone's sheep wandered into the wrong meadow. What began as an argument over a fence post somehow escalated into a full-scale armed conflict, because this was the Middle Ages, and that's how property law worked. According to the Chronica de Sussexia, the battle took place on the very same hill where the Norman duke had triumphed. Both sides clashed with a level of enthusiasm unmatched since the last time England forgot how to share. And then, the truly bizarre happened. One of the Williams, a Saxon descendant, was struck in the eye by an arrow. Same wound, same hill, same name, same collective groan from the heavens. Chroniclers were beside themselves. "A miracle!" cried some. "A sign!" shouted others. "Maybe we should stop standing here," said absolutely no one. The church claimed the coincidence proved divine will still favoured the Normans. The locals, meanwhile, just started avoiding the place altogether. Farmers refused to plough it, travellers refused to camp on it, and one particularly nervous monk wrote that the ground remembers. Centuries later, historians dubbed it the Second Battle of Hastings, less famous than the first, but twice as ironic. 2 Williams, 2 arrows, 1 cursed hill. If time travel ever gets invented, that hill is absolutely off limits, because clearly even the 12th century had its copy-paste glitch. If you're looking for a saint who didn't take martyrdom too seriously, look no further than St. Lawrence, the patron saint of cooks, comedians, and people who die ironically. His story began in Rome, 258 AD, but his sense of humour aged perfectly into the medieval world, mostly because his death set an impossible standard for divine irony. When Emperor Valerian ordered the persecution of Christians, Lawrence, a deacon known for distributing alms, was arrested and told to hand over the church's treasures. Instead of producing gold, he brought a group of beggars and said, "Here are our treasures." Ancient sarcasm, the most dangerous kind. Naturally, the Romans sentenced him to death, but here's where Lawrence truly earned his halo. Instead of a quick beheading, they decided to roast him alive on an iron grill. As the fire blazed beneath him, witnesses claimed he called out, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." Even in agony, the man was workshopping material. Some say he added, "You may eat now," though that might have been medieval fan fiction. The legend spread fast. Monks across Europe adored him, a saint who cracked jokes while literally on fire. It was the kind of dark humour only the Middle Ages could fully appreciate. Cathedrals were dedicated in his name, relics collected, feast days established. And, in a move that feels suspiciously deliberate, countless monasteries built their kitchens next to chapels of St. Lawrence. Because apparently nothing says divine protection like a patron saint who died as dinner, but fate wasn't done laughing. In the 11th century, a monastery in Spain named after St. Lawrence burned to the ground. Everything except the kitchen. The abbot declared it a miracle. The cook declared it predictable. A few decades later, another abbey in Normandy suffered the same fate. Chapel gone, kitchen intact. One monk wrote that St. Lawrence protects his own domain. Another replied, then maybe he could expand his jurisdiction. The church, naturally, called these coincidences signs of divine favour. Personally, I call them cosmic punchlines. St. Lawrence proved one eternal truth. Even in martyrdom, timing is everything. Because if you're going to die for your faith, you might as well make God laugh while doing it. The year was 1313, which already sounds suspicious. The kind of date that feels like it was made to host bad omens. In a chilly scriptorium somewhere in York, a monk named Brother Reginald sat hunched over parchment, quill in hand, and absolutely full of himself. He was writing what he called the Mirror of the World, a prophetic text claiming to reveal divine patterns in history. The kind of thing you write when you're sleep-deprived and overconfident in your Latin. Toward the end of his manuscript, he scribbled a line that would make him famous centuries later. "When two kings share one name and one fate, the world shall tremble and the age shall end dramatic." Yes, accurate. Unfortunately also yes. Reginald died soon after writing it, which is pretty on brand for prophets. His manuscript sat forgotten for nearly 300 years, gathering dust and irony in equal measure. Then, in the 1500s, the prophecy suddenly made a terrifying comeback. Two monarchs, Henry II of France and Henry VIII of England, ruled their respective kingdoms at roughly the same time, both obsessed with power, vanity, and questionable relationship decisions. They were, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of two men racing to out-self-destruct. In 1559, King Henry of France entered a jousting tournament to show off his chivalric vigour. It ended with a lance splinter through his eye. A decade earlier, Henry VIII had died from a festering leg wound caused by, wait for it, a jousting accident. Two Henrys, two kings, two absurdly similar demises. One prophecy that aged a little too well. When scholars rediscovered Brother Reginald's manuscript, panic spread faster than the plague. Pamphlets were printed, preachers ranted, and peasants started checking their calendars for world-ending vibes. The church condemned the text as coincidental blasphemy, which is medieval for "we can't explain this, and it's making us uncomfortable." Of course, the world didn't end, unless you count the rise of Protestantism, several wars, and the death of jousting as a respectable hobby. The mirror prophecy became one of the Middle Ages' most famous coincidences. Two kings, same name, same wound, same stupid hat. If God does have a scriptwriter, this was the episode where they really leaned into the symbolism. Some people dream of dying peacefully in their sleep. Others hope to go out heroically in battle. But in 1199, one monk named Brother Aelred managed to die the way few men ever do, in a fit of laughter. And somehow, it made perfect sense for a man who'd spent his entire life mocking death. Brother Aelred was no ordinary monk. Before taking vows, he had been a jester in the court of a minor English noble, a man paid to make drunk aristocrats snort ale through their noses. But somewhere between the endless banquets and the occasional food fight, Aelred decided to repent. He joined a monastery, traded bells for robes, and became a surprisingly good preacher, if your idea of holiness included punchlines. The other monks loved him, most of the time. His sermons had names like God's Patience and the Abbot's Lack of It. He once carved a smiling face on the refectory door and called it Saint Optimus. When asked why he laughed so much, he reportedly said, "Because the devil hates joy, and I love annoying him." Naturally, this didn't sit well with the abbot, who warned Aelred that laughter leads to sin. Aelred replied, "Then hell must be a very boring place." Somewhere, an angel probably face-palmed. One stormy night, lightning struck the abbey's bell tower. The stone cracked, the roof shook, and a statue of St. Felix the Cheerful, which Aelred himself had commissioned, toppled from its niche. The heavy stone figure landed right on him, killing him instantly. Witnesses said he was laughing at the time, having just told a joke about divine timing. The chronicler's entry reads, "Brother Aelred met his end in laughter, as foretold by his own jest." The abbot called it a warning. The younger monks called it poetic. Personally, I call it a stand-up set with perfect comedic structure. Set-up, irony, punchline. In death, Aelred became an unofficial saint among novices, the patron of joy, bad timing, and people who just can't keep a straight face during prayer. His epitaph, according to rumour, simply read, "He laughed. God laughed louder." If medieval Europe ever had a sense of humour, it died with Brother Aelred, and probably chuckled all the way to heaven. In the harsh, sun-baked highlands of Lusitania, a young shepherd named Viriatus watched over his flock with more patience than most generals ever had for their men. The land was unforgiving, rocky slopes, thin soil, and predators that circled the herds by night. But it was there, among the wolves and the wind, that Viriatus learned endurance. Each day was a battle between man, beast, and hunger. And in those hills, the Romans were just another kind of predator. Rome saw the Iberian tribes as barbarians, wild, untamed, and conveniently taxable. To them, shepherds like Viriatus were beneath notice, unless tribute was due or rebellion brewing. They came demanding grain, gold, and men for their legions. But the Lusitanians were not easily bent. When the tax collectors came again, this time backed by steel, the shepherds picked up their crooks and turned them into spears. Viriatus fought his first skirmish not as a soldier, but as a man defending his home. The Romans expected quick submission. Instead, they met cunning resistance. Viriatus knew every ravine, every narrow trail where cavalry could not follow. When the invaders marched through valleys, his people vanished into the mountains, only to strike from behind. The shepherd became a strategist, his hills the perfect classroom. He was no aristocrat, no general born to command. Yet even among warriors, Viriatus stood apart, calm, calculating, and incorruptible. His fellow tribesmen saw in him a leader who fought not for plunder, but for dignity. Word spread of the shepherd who humiliated Roman columns with nothing but patience and terrain. In a world where loyalty was often bought, his could not be. The Romans, of course, labelled him a bandit. That was their favourite term for anyone who refused to kneel. But even some Roman officers began to murmur admiration, grudgingly perhaps, but sincerely. Viriatus fought like nature itself, silent, elusive, and merciless when cornered. By the time Rome realised the scale of their problem, the shepherd of the hills had become something larger than a man. He was a myth in the making, a ghost in the mountains, whose flocks had long since turned into armies. And Rome, for all its legions, had found its match in a man who once herded sheep. The Romans arrived in Lusitania believing conquest would be as easy as crushing an anthill. They came in armour that gleamed like the sun, carrying standards, banners, and arrogance in equal measure. To them, this land of rugged mountains and wild rivers was merely another line on a growing map. But to the locals, hunters, shepherds, and hillfolk, it was their motherland. And mothers aren't given up without a fight. At first, Viriatus wasn't a general. He was a survivor. When Rome's praetors demanded tributes and hostages, entire villages were enslaved or slaughtered. He barely escaped one such massacre, having witnessed his friends cut down and his kin taken away. That was the day he changed. The shepherd dropped his crook and picked up the sword. The man who once guarded sheep would now guard his people. Viriatus joined a small band of rebels who hid in the hills. Their weapons were mismatched. Rusty swords, hunting spears, even farm tools. But they had something Rome didn't: patience. Viriatus studied his enemy like a wolf studies a herd. He learned how their columns moved, how their scouts reported, how their discipline turned to chaos once the terrain worked against them. The first ambush came at dawn. Roman soldiers were marching through a narrow pass, tired and overconfident. Suddenly, stones rolled down the slopes, arrows whistled from the trees, and men screamed as the mountains came alive. The Romans fought bravely, but not wisely. They couldn't see their enemy, only shadows that struck and vanished. When it was over, hundreds of legionaries lay dead, and Viriatus had become a name whispered with awe and fear alike. Word spread fast. A new leader had risen in Lusitania, a man who fought like the wind and disappeared like smoke. Rome sent more troops, but every campaign ended the same way: ambush, retreat, humiliation. Even the Roman historians, who rarely praised barbarians, couldn't help but respect his brilliance. They called him a man of simple habits and great cunning. But Viriatus wasn't fighting for fame. His goal was freedom, a word the Romans used often, yet seldom granted. He knew they would come again, with more legions and more vengeance. And as the red banners reappeared on the horizon, Viriatus stood on the hilltop, eyes cold and calm, already planning the next move in a war of ghosts. By now, Rome had learned Viriatus's name and hated it. His guerrilla tactics were humiliating the mightiest army in the world. To them, he was a bandit, a pest. To his people, he was the wolf of Lusitania, the one who bit the eagle's claw and lived. Viriatus built his resistance not with grand speeches, but with quiet conviction. He knew every ridge and valley, every stream and shadow of the land. His army was a reflection of the terrain, fluid, unpredictable, untamable. While Roman generals depended on order and formations, Viriatus turned chaos into his weapon. His men travelled light, slept under the stars, and vanished before dawn. They fought in small bands, striking supply lines, ambushing scouts, and stealing weapons from the dead. He trained his warriors not to fight like Romans, but to fight against them. Never meet a wall head-on, he told them. Climb it, break it, or go around it. His soldiers became expert riders and trackers, using horn signals and smoke plumes to communicate across the hills. When Rome sent columns of heavy infantry into narrow ravines, Viriatus trapped them between fire and stone. He didn't win by numbers. He won by wit. The more the Romans tried to crush him, the stronger his legend grew. Villagers began offering him food, water, and shelter. Shepherds became spies. Even some Iberian tribes once hostile to Lusitania joined his cause. Rome had tried to conquer a province, but instead they had united it. One Roman commander, Servilianus, thought he could end it by sheer force. He brought 20,000 men and promised the Senate a quick victory. Instead, he found himself surrounded, his troops starved and desperate. When Servilianus finally surrendered, expecting slaughter, Viriatus did something that left even his enemies speechless. He spared them. He allowed the Romans to leave unharmed, under oath that they would respect Lusitania's independence. It was a move not of mercy, but of power. The shepherd-turned-warrior had forced Rome to negotiate, a humiliation recorded in their own annals. But peace with Rome was like peace with a viper. They slithered back to their camps, swearing vengeance. Viriatus had outsmarted them again, but deep down he knew this couldn't last. Wolves can outrun hunters for a time, but not forever. For a fleeting moment, peace seemed possible. The treaty Viriatus forced upon Servilianus was unprecedented. Rome had acknowledged a free Lusitania. The shepherd who once hid in the mountains was now the de facto ruler of a liberated people. His warriors hailed him as Dux, a title that would one day echo across empires. Songs were sung around campfires about the man who outwitted Rome's legions with nothing but courage and cunning. But Rome's memory is long, and her pride even longer. In the Senate, the news of a treaty with barbarians was met with outrage. The elders of Rome couldn't stomach the idea that their generals had bowed to a shepherd. Negotiating with rebels, one senator spat, is like feeding a wolf and hoping it turns into a dog. They ordered a new commander to Hispania, Fabius Maximus Servilianus's successor, Quintus Servilius Caepio, a man with the patience of a vulture and the ambition of a snake. His mission was simple: destroy Viriatus at any cost. Meanwhile, Viriatus ruled with humility. He didn't wear a crown or sit on a throne. He still rode his horse through the villages, greeting farmers, helping them rebuild what war had burned. He forbade looting and cruelty, insisting that they fight with honor. To him, freedom wasn't a slogan. It was sacred. Even Roman prisoners were often spared, a policy that earned him admiration from enemies and loyalty from friends. When Caepio arrived, he brought not just soldiers, but spies, informants, and silver. He knew that Viriatus could not be beaten by force. He had to be weakened from within. Slowly, Rome began spreading lies, rumours of disloyalty among Viriatus's allies, whispers of betrayal in the night. The new campaign was psychological. Rome offered gold and titles to those who would abandon the Lusitanian cause. Some chieftains began to waver, wondering how long they could fight a war that seemed endless. Viriatus, ever perceptive, sensed the shift. He held councils under torchlight, reminding his warriors of their purpose. "Rome fights for empire," he said. "We fight for home. But even heroes can't hold back exhaustion forever." The war had dragged on for nearly a decade. Fields lay barren, villages empty, and even the bravest hearts began to tremble. The Wolf of Lusitania was still standing, but the hunters were closing in. The Romans, humbled but unbroken, changed their approach. They no longer sought grand battles. They sought bloodless victories. Gold, deceit, and diplomacy would now do what legions could not. Caepio, the new commander, was cunning where others were proud. He studied Viriatus as one might study a storm, impossible to stop, but perhaps possible to redirect. He began courting the Lusitanian tribes one by one. Messengers whispered promises of Roman citizenship, fertile land, and eternal peace. For some chieftains, exhausted after years of mountain warfare, the sound of coin was sweeter than the call of duty. But for Viriatus, such treachery cut deeper than any blade. He had built his rebellion on loyalty, not plunder. Each defection was a fracture in his heart. Still, he fought on. His scouts ambushed Roman detachments, stole their supplies, and melted into the wilderness before counterattack. Yet, the victories grew smaller, the celebrations quieter. Food was scarce, horses were dying. The mountain wind carried not the songs of triumph, but the sighs of fatigue. Viriatus's wife, a fierce Lusitanian woman named Galducia, begged him to rest, to think of life beyond war. But he couldn't. "If I sleep," he told her, "Rome wakes." For him, the fight was no longer just for land. It was for dignity, for the right to exist without bending the knee. Caepio, sensing weakness, tightened the noose. His spies infiltrated Viriatus's circle, spreading doubt and greed. Among them were 3 trusted lieutenants, Audax, Ditalcus, and Menurus, men who had once sworn eternal loyalty. Caepio promised them what Viriatus never could, Roman gold and safe passage. When the next skirmish ended in victory for the Lusitanians, Viriatus called a feast. Wine flowed, torches flickered, and laughter returned for the first time in months. None knew it would be their last night together. As the camp slept, the 3 traitors slipped into his tent. Viriatus, exhausted, lay on his cot, his sword beside him. They knelt before him, as if seeking counsel, then drew their daggers. The first strike pierced his throat, the second silenced him forever. The man who had defied Rome for nearly a decade was gone, not by battle, but by betrayal. And as dawn broke over the hills of Lusitania, the wolf who had once howled against an empire lay still, his dream of freedom bleeding into the earth. Morning came cold and cruel. The Lusitanian camp stirred in uneasy silence. It was Galducia who found him first. Viriatus, her husband, their leader, the soul of their rebellion, lying still, his face peaceful, as if merely asleep. When the truth spread, disbelief turned to wailing. The wolf was dead, and with him, the heart of Lusitania broke. His killers, Audax, Ditalcus, and Menurus, hurried to the Roman camp, expecting applause, silver, and Roman citizenship. They were led before Caepio, smiling like jackals before a lion. "We have done your bidding," they said proudly. "Viriatus is no more." Caepio listened, nodded, and then turned to his guards. "Rome does not pay traitors," he said coldly. "Kill them." And so, the 3 men who sold their leader for gold died without reward, their bodies dumped into the dust. Treachery, it seemed, was useful, but never honourable. The Romans believed the rebellion would die with its leader. They were wrong. When Viriatus's warriors discovered how he had been betrayed, grief turned to rage. They lifted his body high on a shield, the way kings were honoured among warriors, and carried him to the mountains. There, under the open sky he loved, they built his funeral pyre. The flames rose like a beacon, lighting the valleys below. Men wept, women sang, children clutched their mothers and watched the fire swallow their hero. "Here lies Viriatus," they said, "the friend of justice, the enemy of Rome." Even Roman chroniclers, bitter as they were, recorded his death with a touch of awe. The historian Appian wrote that Viriatus was the most remarkable of all generals produced by the barbarian races. He had led shepherds against legions and nearly won. He had forced Rome to bow, not by power, but by persistence, yet without him, the resistance crumbled. His followers, leaderless and disheartened, signed peace with Rome soon after. Lusitania was absorbed into the empire, its warriors turned into subjects, its hills echoing only with memory. But legends don't die with their makers. For centuries after, Iberian storytellers whispered Viriatus's name around firesides. They called him the last free man, the shepherd who became a general, and the general who became a symbol. And though Rome erased kingdoms and languages, it never erased the wolf's howl that once rose from Lusitania's hills. Years passed, and Rome moved on, at least on paper. Lusitania became another obedient province, its fields taxed, its men conscripted, its language slowly drowned beneath Latin. But among the mountains and valleys, the people still told stories. Stories of a shepherd who defied an empire, of a man who could vanish into the mist, only to strike from the shadows like a spirit of vengeance. That man, Viriatus, became less of a memory and more of a myth. In every village, children grew up hearing how he outwitted generals, how he showed mercy to his enemies, and how he died betrayed by those he trusted most. Mothers told their sons, "Be as brave as Viriatus, but never trust a Roman's promise." His name became a lesson, a symbol of resistance and integrity that even the conquerors couldn't extinguish. Ironically, some Romans began to admire him too. Philosophers like Cicero, centuries later, mentioned him with reluctant respect, calling him a great enemy of Rome, but a noble one. It was the kind of praise the Republic reserved only for men it couldn't truly defeat. Even Roman soldiers stationed in Hispania spoke of him with a strange reverence, like one might speak of a worthy rival who refused to bow. But what made Viriatus's legacy endure wasn't just his victories. It was his spirit. He didn't fight to become king or to plunder Rome's riches. He fought for something simpler and purer, the right of ordinary people to live free on their own land. He turned a band of farmers and shepherds into an army, not by promising spoils, but by giving them something to believe in. Generations later, when new conquerors arrived, the Visigoths, the Moors, and even the Christian kingdoms that followed, they all encountered the same stubborn fire. That refusal to kneel, that pride in the land, that whisper of the wolf. It was all Viriatus's inheritance. He had planted rebellion in the soil itself. By the time Portugal emerged as its own nation many centuries later, poets and chroniclers looked back and claimed him as their first hero. Statues rose, songs were written, and Viriatus's face was carved in stone. The Romans had burned his body, but his spirit remained carved into Iberia's mountains, a shepherd watching forever over his people. Long after Viriatus's pyre had turned to ash, the land he fought for still bore his mark. The mountains of Lusitania whispered his name in the wind, and the rivers that once ran red with Roman blood now flowed in quiet remembrance. To the common people, he became more than a hero. He was a presence. Shepherds claimed to see his spirit wandering the hills at twilight, a cloaked figure on horseback, watching over them in silence. "The wolf still guards us," they said. Even as Rome continued to grow, consuming nations like a fire devours forests, it could never quite tame the Iberian spirit. Every rebellion that flared in the peninsula carried a trace of Viriatus's defiance. His story spread beyond Lusitania, across Hispania, and even to distant Gaul, where rebels whispered his name like a charm for courage. To resist Rome was madness, Yet Viriatus had proven it was possible, at least for a time. Roman poets, ever the recorders of irony, began to invoke him as a tragic hero, a noble savage undone by betrayal. To them, his death was a moral tale about the futility of pride. To his people, it was proof that Rome feared men who refused to kneel. The difference in interpretation said everything about empire and resistance. Centuries later, when Rome itself began to crumble under its own weight, Iberian bards smiled knowingly. "The wolf waits," they said. "Empires rise, empires fall, but the will to be free, that is eternal." Viriatus's story became a prophecy fulfilled. The same mountains that once sheltered him now sheltered others, who defied new overlords, each rebellion a small echo of his roar. His grave was never found, because perhaps there never was one. The pyre's ashes scattered with the wind, mingling with the soil and the grass. Farmers ploughing their fields claimed their blades sometimes struck strange stones that glimmered like silver. They said those were Viriatus's tears, left behind for every free soul yet unborn. Even the church, centuries later, couldn't erase him. They softened his story, calling him a man of virtue, a pagan with the soul of a saint. But in the villages, they kept the truth. Viriatus wasn't holy. He was human. And that was exactly why he mattered. Because one human had made Rome tremble. Time buried kingdoms, temples, and emperors, but not the memory of the shepherd who defied Rome. 2,000 years later, his name still clings to the rocks of Iberia, like moss to stone. Statues now stand where his camp once was, bronze and defiant, eyes forever fixed on the horizon, as if still watching for red banners on the wind. And in those statues, in those songs and whispers, Viriatus still breathes. Historians would later argue about who he really was. Some claimed he was a noble who turned outlaw, others a peasant who rose through sheer will. But the truth, perhaps, lies somewhere simpler. He was a man who refused to bow. In a world built on hierarchy, where Rome demanded obedience and men obeyed, Viriatus proved that freedom could be born from the humblest soul. He was proof that courage doesn't require titles, only conviction. Modern Portugal and Spain both claim him as their own, his story bridging the ancient tribes that became nations. In Beja, in central Portugal, a statue of him stands atop a hill, sword raised, cloak flowing like the wind itself. Schoolchildren visit the monument and learn how one shepherd humiliated the legions that conquered the known world. Even now, his name carries a strange electricity, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and defiance. Writers have called him the Iberian Leonidas, the freedom fighter before freedom existed, even the soul of the peninsula. And in many ways, he was all of these. His war was lost, but his message outlived victory, that empires fall, but dignity endures. He became an ancestor of every rebellion that followed, from the medieval revolts against Moorish rule to the resistance movements of modern times. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Viriatus is that his story refuses to end. He has no tomb, no relics, no marble bust. Just a name carried by wind and memory. To the Romans, he was an inconvenience. To history, he became inevitability. The idea that every empire meets its mirror, every conqueror faces a conscience. And so, when the wind howls through the Portuguese hills, the locals still say it's Viriatus calling. The shepherd who became a symbol, the warrior who became a legend, the man who, in dying, taught the world how to live free. 12th century Jerusalem was a paradox, a city drenched in holiness and blood. Pilgrims arrived from every corner of Christendom seeking salvation, and many found death instead. War, heat, disease, and the wounds of crusade filled the streets with misery. But beyond the city walls, away from the chanting priests and the glimmering domes, stood a sanctuary where the unwanted were received. The Hospital of St. Lazarus. It wasn't a grand structure like the churches of the Templars or the Hospitallers. There were no marble floors, no shining banners. Its walls were made of rough stone, and its courtyards smelled faintly of incense, vinegar, and sickness. Yet within it lived men whose courage would humble even the proudest knights of the age. They were lepers, men scarred, disfigured, and slowly dying, yet still they wore the cross. The brothers of St. Lazarus were outcasts of the crusading world. When knights from the other orders fell ill, they were banished here, stripped of their colours and command. But instead of despair, many found purpose. "We who are unfit for life," one chronicler wrote, "serve the living by tending the dying." And from this strange fraternity of suffering came a kind of holiness that no cathedral could contain. The hospital became more than a refuge. It became a fortress of compassion. The brothers treated pilgrims, crusaders, and townsfolk alike, washing wounds, mixing herbs, and whispering prayers over those who had no hope. Yet their duty did not end at the sickbed. When enemies drew near, the brothers took up arms. Covered in green robes to hide their sores, faces wrapped in linen, they mounted their horses and rode beneath the banner of St. Lazarus, a white cross on a field of green. To many, it was a terrifying sight, men who looked half dead charging into battle. But to those who knew their hearts, it was something else entirely, the purest form of bravery. These were knights who had nothing left to lose, who fought not for glory, but for redemption. Outside the walls of Jerusalem, amid the stench of sickness and sanctity, a new kind of order had been born, one where compassion and courage shared the same armour. The Knights of St. Lazarus were born from rejection. While the world glorified shining armour and unblemished faces, these men bore scars that made others recoil. In the courts of the Templars and Hospitallers, a leper's touch was a death sentence. Yet those same men, cast out and branded as cursed, found brotherhood in a crumbling hospital beyond Jerusalem's walls. It was here that the forgotten built something divine, a home where no one was too broken to serve God. In the eyes of the Crusader elite, leprosy was punishment, a visible mark of sin. The disease disfigured faces, numbed limbs, and devoured flesh. But inside the walls of St. Lazarus, the suffering became sanctified. Every scar was treated as a badge of faith, every wound a reminder of Christ's passion. The brothers prayed, tended the sick, and swore vows as sacred as any Templar: poverty, chastity, obedience, and most of all, service. When leper knights rode together, they were bound by more than oath. They were bound by exile. The healthy knights called them the damned in armour, but those words only hardened their resolve. They rode without fear, because fear belonged to those who hoped for long lives. The Lazarites fought for mercy, for the souls of the dying, and for their own. Their banner, a green cross on white, symbolized renewal and eternal life. A strange irony for men whose flesh was already decaying. The order's ranks grew quickly. Crusaders who contracted leprosy often sought refuge there, and instead of despair, many found purpose again. They could no longer serve in glorious companies like the Templars or Hospitallers, but here, in the Order of St. Lazarus, their courage still mattered. The hospital trained them in medicine, healing arts, and, when war demanded it, combat once more. And so, the Knights of Disease became the Knights of Devotion. They tended to the rotting and the forgotten, washed the wounds of the dying, and then rode out beside them to face the enemy. To their foes, they were ghosts in armour. To their allies, they were a miracle, proof that even in suffering, one could still be holy. They were lepers, they were warriors, and above all, they were proof that God's grace could bloom even from decay. By the mid-12th century, the Knights of St. Lazarus had become a paradox that baffled even the Church itself, an order both sacred and grotesque. They were holy men whose bodies were falling apart, yet they carried swords and banners into battle with the conviction of saints. Most men fled from disease. These knights rode into it willingly. Their leper colonies, scattered across the Holy Land, were half monastery, half fortress. Within, the air was thick with incense meant to mask the smell of rot, and hymns mingled with the groans of the afflicted. But when word spread that Muslim raiders threatened nearby villages, the bell of St. Lazarus rang out, and every crippled soldier answered. They would limp to their horses, strap on armour with trembling hands, and march toward battle, faces veiled, eyes burning with devotion. To their enemies, it was a terrifying sight. Chroniclers from Damascus wrote of phantom knights whose flesh peeled beneath their armour, yet who fought as if possessed. Arrows did not seem to stop them. Pain no longer held sway. Even the mightiest Saracen cavalry hesitated when the green cross banner appeared. For to kill a leper knight was to risk becoming one. Their very touch carried dread. And yet, for all their horror, they fought with a strange compassion. The Lazarite knights saw themselves as defenders of the dying, protectors of souls too fragile for the world of kings and popes. When the smoke cleared, they were often found tending to both friend and foe alike, dressing wounds with trembling fingers. They saw no difference between a Christian in pain and a Muslim in agony. Suffering was universal, and mercy had no language. Even the Templars, who once scorned them, began to respect their valour. On several campaigns, the two orders rode side by side, and many chroniclers noted that the Lazarites never retreated, even when hopelessly outnumbered. They believed that dying in battle was no punishment, it was freedom from the prison of their own bodies. By the time the Crusades reached their peak, the Knights of St. Lazarus had earned a new name whispered across Christendom: the Leper Crusaders. They were the last soldiers one would expect to fight, and yet the first to ride when death came calling. As the Crusades dragged on, the Knights of St. Lazarus found themselves at the heart of a strange evolution. What began as a hospital for outcasts had transformed into a disciplined military brotherhood under the unmistakable banner of the Green Cross. The symbol, painted on shields and robes, stood not just for healing, but for resurrection, a promise that life, even one marked by decay, could still serve the divine. By 1150, the order had earned recognition from kings and popes alike. The Patriarch of Jerusalem granted them privileges equal to the Hospitallers, and donations began to pour in from lords across Europe. Estates in France, England and Italy funded new hospitals and fortified monasteries. The Leper Knights were no longer hidden in the shadows. They had become an indispensable arm of Christendom's military and spiritual effort, yet their rise brought discomfort. The Templars saw them as a reminder of mortality, and the Hospitallers viewed them as rivals in charity. The Lazarites, however, paid no mind to envy. Their motto was not conquest, but compassion. "We cure the sick and fight the wicked," one brother wrote, a line that became their creed. They began recruiting not only the diseased, but also healthy knights who pledged to serve alongside their ailing brethren. These men, knowing full well the risk, joined out of piety or penance, sharing quarters with the infected, eating from the same bowls, and often falling ill themselves. The Green Cross became a mark of self-sacrifice. In battle, the Lazarites rode in the second or third line, not by command, but by choice. They believed those who were dying should not take the glory of the first charge, but instead be the last wall standing. Chroniclers noted how, when the front ranks broke, the Leper Knights stood fast, coughing blood into their helmets, yet refusing to yield. They fought not for victory, but to buy time for others to retreat. Their courage did not go unnoticed. Even King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, himself afflicted by leprosy, drew inspiration from them. He visited their hospital often, speaking with the knights whose faith burned as fiercely as his own. Together, they became living symbols of a paradoxical truth, that holiness often wears a scarred face. When King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem took the throne in 1174, he was already dying. His hands were numb, his face pale, his body wasting away. Leprosy had marked him before he ever wore a crown. To his enemies, he was a walking corpse. To his people, a miracle in armour. And in his weakness, he found kinship with the Knights of St. Lazarus, men who bore the same disease but refused to surrender to despair. The young king often visited their hospital, not as a monarch, but as a brother in affliction, The Lazarite knights treated him not with ceremony, but with understanding. Among them, he wasn't the leper king, but simply Baldwin, another soldier enduring the will of God. Chroniclers tell that he would sometimes ride with them into battle, his hands too weak to wield a sword, yet his courage shining brighter than any weapon. Under Baldwin's reign, the Order of St. Lazarus reached its peak. The king granted them lands, fortifications, and royal favour, declaring that no hand is too withered to serve the Lord. His words transformed how Christendom saw them. For the first time, the diseased were not just pitied, they were honoured. The Lazarites built new hospitals across the Crusader states, each one both hospice and fortress. The largest, near Jerusalem, could house hundreds of patients and was surrounded by high walls, not to keep the sick in, but to keep invaders out. But the king's friendship came at a cost. Baldwin's condition worsened, and by the time of the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, he could barely sit upright. Yet he rode out anyway, flanked by the Knights of St. Lazarus. Together, they faced Saladin's vastly superior army, and against all odds, they won. Chroniclers say the sight of the Leper King and his leper knights charging into the fray struck terror even into hardened warriors. For one shining moment, disease and despair were forgotten. Jerusalem rejoiced. The cross of St. Lazarus flew high beside the royal standard. But victory is a fleeting thing in the Holy Land. Baldwin's body soon failed him, and with his death, both the kingdom and the Lazarite order would begin their long descent into shadow. When Baldwin IV died in 1185, Jerusalem lost more than a king, it lost its shield. Within 2 years, Saladin swept across the Holy Land like a desert storm, uniting the Muslim armies and striking with divine fury. The Crusader states, fractured by greed and pride, were no match. The green cross of St. Lazarus still fluttered above the city walls, but the men beneath it were dwindling. Many were too ill to fight, yet none refused. As Saladin's armies closed in, the Knights of St. Lazarus prepared their hospital for the inevitable. The healthy helped the sick into armour, binding bandaged hands around sword hilts, knowing they would never return. Chroniclers tell of a haunting scene, a procession of leper knights riding through Jerusalem's narrow streets, faces wrapped in linen, eyes hollow but fierce. The people bowed as they passed, not out of pity, but reverence. When the siege began, the Lazarites fought at the city's northern gate beside the Templars. They held their ground for days, coughing blood, their armour fused to rotting flesh. Each time the Saracens stormed the walls, the leper knights counter-attacked with a desperation born of faith. Their enemies feared them, not for their numbers, but for their refusal to die quietly. One Muslim chronicler described them as men whose sickness makes them fearless, for they already dwell halfway in the grave, but courage could not stop the tide. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem fell. The holy city that had drawn knights from every corner of Europe was gone, surrendered to Saladin's mercy. The Templars and Hospitallers fled north to regroup. The Lazarites, however, refused to abandon their patients. When Saladin entered the city, he found them still tending the sick, Christian and Muslim alike. Moved by their compassion, the great Sultan spared them. He ordered that the hospital of St. Lazarus be left untouched, and that its brothers be allowed to continue their work. It was one of the few sanctuaries in Jerusalem to survive the conquest. And so, while empires fell and armies burned, the Lazarites remained. Their swords were broken, but their purpose endured: to heal, to serve, and to suffer with dignity, even when the world itself seemed lost. After the fall of Jerusalem, the surviving Knights of St. Lazarus scattered across the Holy Land like seeds in the wind. Their hospital, once a sanctuary for the dying, now stood in enemy hands. Yet the order refused to perish. Those who escaped fled north to Acre, where the remnants of the Crusader states clung desperately to the coast. There, among the ruins of hope, the Lazarites began again. Acre became their new Jerusalem. They built another hospital near the harbour, a modest fortress where ships arrived bearing pilgrims, wounded soldiers, and the sick from across the sea. The leper knights, maimed and limping, returned to their calling, tending to the forgotten. To the casual eye, they looked like monks at prayer, but their green cross banner still flew over the ramparts. Their mission had simply shifted. If they could no longer guard the Holy Sepulchre, they would guard the suffering. Pope Clement confirmed their rule and blessed their endurance, granting them privileges equal to the Hospitallers. Donations from Europe once again trickled in, not from nobles seeking glory, but from those seeking redemption. To give to the Lazarites was considered an act of mercy. To join them was to embrace martyrdom. Their knights still fought when called. During the later Crusades, they rode beside the Templars and Hospitallers once more, though their numbers were few. Chroniclers described them as living relics, men whose armour hid the slow decay of their bodies. But their presence on the battlefield lifted morale. For if lepers could charge into battle, what excuse did the healthy have to fear? When Acre fell in 1291, ending the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, the Lazarites evacuated to Cyprus, and later to France and Italy. There, they continued their work quietly, establishing hospitals in Marseille, Boigny, and Capua. They became healers of plague victims, protectors of the terminally ill, and keepers of leper houses. The sword had been replaced by the scalpel, the fortress by the infirmary. In exile, they shed their military glory, but not their soul. The green cross endured, now a symbol of compassion rather than combat. Though the Holy Land was lost, the Lazarites had learned something greater. Holiness was not bound to territory, but to mercy. By the dawn of the 14th century, the age of crusading had faded, but the Knights of St. Lazarus endured, quietly, stubbornly, almost invisibly. No longer did their banners flutter over the deserts of Palestine. Instead, they hung above the gates of leper hospitals scattered across Europe. In France, Italy, and England, their houses became sanctuaries where the world's unwanted were treated with dignity. The knights themselves were changing. Leprosy was still feared, but it was no longer seen purely as divine punishment. The Lazarites, once regarded as cursed, were now seen as humble servants of God's mercy. Still, the stigma clung to them like the disease itself. Many of their hospitals were built far outside city walls, down lonely roads where healthy men seldom walked. Those who joined their ranks, whether healthy or afflicted, did so knowing they were stepping into social death. Yet within those walls, a quiet revolution was happening. The Lazarites developed some of the earliest forms of isolation wards, herbal salves, and antiseptic balms. They observed the progression of disease with monastic discipline, documenting symptoms and treatments in careful Latin notes. Long before universities studied infection, these leper knights were already practicing primitive epidemiology, driven not by science but by compassion. Their influence reached even into royal courts. French and English monarchs, aware of their service, began to grant the order land and protection. King Louis of France formally recognized the Lazarites' mother house at Boigny, turning it into a place of pilgrimage for nobles seeking penance. Even healthy knights began joining the order voluntarily, men weary of politics and war who sought redemption through service. In a world still obsessed with chivalric pride, the Lazarites represented a quieter, humbler kind of heroism. Still, the order never entirely lost its martial edge. In times of plague or war, the Green Cross once again appeared on the battlefield, this time over wagons of wounded soldiers, not charging horses. They became the predecessors of the military medical corps that would follow centuries later. Though the world had moved on from the Crusades, the Knights of St. Lazarus continued to live by their paradox. Warriors of mercy, guardians of decay. Forgotten by history perhaps, but never by those whose lives they saved in silence. Centuries passed, and the once feared word leper faded from European tongues. Yet the Green Cross of St. Lazarus endured, reborn in new eras, reshaped by new wars, but always true to its first vow: to serve those whom the world would rather forget. The medieval knights who once charged into battle while their flesh decayed had long vanished, but their spirit outlived the disease that defined them. By the 17th century, the order had transformed once again. No longer a refuge for the afflicted, it became a noble order of chivalry under royal patronage. In France, King Henry IV merged the Lazarites with another brotherhood, forming the Order of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and St. Lazarus. Its members were no longer leper warriors, but aristocrats and physicians, funding hospitals, tending the poor, and carrying on the tradition of mercy. Their green cross now shone, not on shields, but on medallions, symbols of service rather than defiance. Yet traces of the old order lingered. In remote hospitals of Provence and Italy, a few brothers still lived as healers, caring for those afflicted by new plagues that swept through Europe. When smallpox and pestilence struck, the Lazarites were among the first to enter infected towns, often never to return. They had become, once again, what they were born to be, a fellowship of those unafraid to suffer for others. Through revolutions, inquisitions, and empires, the order refused to die. Suppressed during the French Revolution, it resurfaced in the 19th century, when philanthropists and soldiers revived its ideals. The Green Cross appeared once more in hospitals and field tents, this time alongside the Red Cross and other humanitarian emblems. The Lazarite legacy had seeped into the very foundation of medical care and wartime compassion. Today, the Order of St. Lazarus still exists, not as a crusading army, but as a global charitable organization, supporting hospitals, leprosy treatment, and humanitarian aid. Few of its modern members know the full weight of its origins. Knights who fought while dying, who found holiness in horror, and who turned disease into devotion. From the dusty roads of Jerusalem to the sterile halls of modern medicine, their message remains unchanged. That courage is not the absence of suffering, but the grace to serve through it. The Green Cross still glows, eternal, humble, and unbroken. When the long winter finally loosened its grip on the Illyrian mountains, a strange rhythm began to stir across the valleys. Smoke rose from distant hills, horns echoed through the gorges, and men on horseback carried news from tribe to tribe. The festival was coming. It was the time when the scattered clans of Illyria, the Taulanti, the Dardanians, the Daorsi, and countless others, left their strongholds and gathered beneath the open sky. For once, their swords were not drawn for war, but for celebration. The great festival was more than sport. It was the pulse of Illyrian identity. It took place in the season of renewal, when herds fattened and rivers ran full, usually near the sacred plains between the sea and the mountains. Chiefs rode in with their warriors and their herdsmen. Women with braids of gold and amber led processions of songs, and the air filled with the smell of roasted meat, pine smoke, and mead. At the heart of the gathering was the race, a contest older than any king. Horses were sacred in Illyrian belief, messengers between mortals and gods. Before each race, the priests of Medorus, the god of war and protection, would bless the steeds, sprinkling them with oil and crushed laurel leaves. Drums beat like thunder as the riders mounted their horses, each adorned with bronze ornaments and coloured ribbons, green for the mountains, red for blood and glory, blue for the rivers that nourished them. When the signal was given, a horn blast sharp as lightning, the horses bolted forward in a cloud of dust. The crowd roared, stamping their feet on the earth as if to race alongside them. The riders leaned low, guiding their mounts with knees and whips of plaited leather. To win was not just to claim a prize, it was to earn immortality in song. By nightfall, when the races ended, torches lined the plains. The victors were lifted onto shields, crowned with wreaths of oak leaves, and poets sang of their triumphs around the fires. In a world of constant tribal rivalries, these few days of unity and celebration were sacred. For in those moments, the Illyrians remembered they were one people, proud, fierce, and forever bound to their horses. To the Illyrians, horses were not mere beasts of burden. They were divine companions, symbols of freedom, and living vessels of the gods. From childhood, Illyrian boys learned that a man's worth could be measured by the strength of his steed. and the steadiness of his hand. The horse was sacred to Medorus, their warrior god, and to the sun deity who carried daylight across the heavens in a chariot. When an Illyrian rode, he was not simply racing the wind, he was imitating the gods themselves. These sacred animals were bred in the highland pastures where the air was thin and cold. The mares grazed on wild thyme and mountain grasses, giving their offspring speed and endurance. Tribal artisans adorned them in bronze, decorative chest plates, bridles with dangling discs that glittered in sunlight, and bells that sang as they galloped. The sound of those bells became a herald of power. When an Illyrian chief approached, the people could hear his arrival before they saw his banner. Before the races began, the horses underwent ritual purification. Women led them to the riverbanks at dawn, washing their coats in the cold waters of the Drin or the Shkumbin. The priests burned incense of pine and juniper, while reciting hymns to Medorus, asking him to let the hoof strike the ground as lightning, and the breath of the horse carry the will of the tribe. Every tribe brought its finest mount, not just for glory, but as a statement of identity. The Illyrians even believed that the souls of warriors who died bravely could return as horses. For this reason, to mistreat one was a sin, a betrayal of the ancestors. When a horse perished in battle or in the races, it was buried with ceremony, bronze bits placed in its mouth, and its mane braided with red wool to guide it to the afterlife. On the eve of the festival, the stables rang with snorts and stamping hooves. Warriors whispered to their mounts as though to brothers, promising victory or death. At sunrise, when the first light hit the hills, the Illyrian sacred companions stood ready, glistening, restless, and radiant with divine pride. In their eyes burned the wild heart of a nation that refused to be tamed. On the eve of the great races, the Illyrian plains turned into a sea of music, laughter, and firelight. Every tribe arrived with gifts, amphorae of honeyed wine, baskets of smoked fish, and whole oxen roasted on spits that turned slowly under the stars. The smell of meat and pine resin mingled with the sound of flutes and drums, and for one sacred night, even rival clans forgot their grudges. The festival was not merely a sporting event, it was a living act of unity, a reminder that before the kingdoms and wars, they had been one people. The chiefs gathered in circles, their cloaks fastened with bronze clasps shaped like wolves and eagles. Skalds, the tribal poets, recited epics of old victories, invoking the spirits of the ancestors who once fought side by side. The younger men listened wide-eyed, knowing that the races of tomorrow were not just games, but a way to prove themselves worthy of those who came before. Winning meant more than personal glory. It meant earning the favour of the gods and securing the tribe's honour for another year. Meanwhile, the women prepared charms for the riders. They braided horsehair with red thread for protection and tied small bronze discs to the saddles, their soft clinking believed to drive away misfortune. Some even whispered secret prayers to Vidasus and Thana, the Illyrian divine pair of fertility and strength, asking them to bless the steeds with divine swiftness. As the night deepened, the feasting reached its peak. Horns of wine were passed from hand to hand, songs grew louder, and laughter rolled across the plains like thunder. Warriors performed mock duels by firelight, more dance than battle, while children imitated horse races with sticks and ribbons. When the moon reached its highest point, a hush fell over the crowd. The priests stepped forward, carrying torches, and poured wine onto the earth in offering. To the gods of speed, of courage, and of life, they chanted, let the sun rise upon worthy riders. The people repeated their words in unison. It was a simple prayer, but it bound thousands together in spirit. By dawn, the fires would die, and the real test of glory would begin. When dawn finally broke, a golden haze spread over the Illyrian plains. The fires from the night's feasting still smouldered, their smoke curling into the crisp mountain air. One by one, the tribes awoke to the sound of horns echoing across the valleys, a call that sent waves of excitement through the camp. It was race day, the sacred day of the gods of sun and speed. The riders began their preparations in silence. Each man tended to his horse as if to a comrade in arms. They brushed the coats until they gleamed, tightened leather straps, and whispered blessings taught by their elders. Some smeared ash across their foreheads for protection. Others tied charms to their arms, bits of bronze, wolf teeth, or eagle feathers. The women sang softly as they watched, their voices rising and falling like wind over grass. At the edge of the field, priests of Medorus and Vidasus stood before an altar of stone. They poured milk and honey onto the ground, calling on the divine to favour the brave. The horses were led in circles around the altar, stamping and tossing their heads, their manes woven with coloured ribbons representing each tribe. The air vibrated with tension and reverence. Soon the crowd gathered. Chiefs and elders stood in fur-lined cloaks, while farmers, hunters and children perched on rocks and wooden fences to see the track. It wasn't a perfect oval like the Roman circuses would later build. It was a long, winding stretch of dirt and grass, carved by time and hooves. The starting line was marked by 2 spears stuck into the earth. When the high priest lifted the horn, the noise died instantly. Every sound, the birds, the crowd, even the wind, seemed to pause. The horn's blast rang out, sharp as thunder, and in an instant the world exploded into motion. The horses lunged forward, pounding across the plain, their hooves shaking the earth. Riders bent low, shouting war cries, their hair and ribbons flying in the wind. Dust rose behind them like a storm. The race had begun, not just for victory, but for honour, for the favour of the gods, and for the right to have one's name sung across the Illyrian mountains for generations to come. The sound of the race was unlike anything else in the world. It began as a rumble, a low tremor that spread through the soil, through the soles of bare feet and the hearts of those who listened. Then it grew. Thunder, fury, life itself. The Illyrian horses charged across the open plain, muscles rippling beneath their bronze ornaments, manes flying like banners of war. Each stride was a heartbeat of the land, a rhythm older than any kingdom. The riders leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hands gripping the reins with the calm precision of hunters. Some rode bareback, trusting only their balance and the bond with their steed. Others had simple saddles of leather and hide, worn smooth from generations of riders. Dust rose behind them, clouding the morning sun, so that the whole valley seemed caught in a haze of golden fire. Each tribe had its champion. The Dardanians rode fierce mountain horses, small, quick, bred for endurance. The Taulanti riders favoured strength, their steeds massive and muscular, thundering like storm gods. The Darsi, proud and reckless, raced with reckless abandon, steering with their knees while waving spears or branches in the air, shouting to the crowd. The spectators roared back, thousands of voices echoing from cliff to cliff. The names of riders were shouted, their tribes praised, their ancestors invoked. Children clapped, elders chanted blessings, and the drums from the night before resumed their thunder, matching the tempo of the hooves. At the halfway point, the track narrowed between 2 great stones, and here came the danger. Riders jostled for position, their horses brushing shoulder to shoulder. One misstep meant disaster, a fall, a broken limb, or worse. When one horse stumbled, its rider rolled clear, covered in dust, rising to lift his arm defiantly to the cheering crowd. To fall and rise again was a mark of courage, not shame. As they approached the final stretch, the air was electric. The priests raised their torches, and the crowd's roar turned into a single deafening chant. Every rider urged his horse onward, hearts pounding in rhythm with the hooves. Victory was seconds away, and for one man, immortality waited just beyond the finish line. When the dust began to settle, the first rider burst through the haze like a spirit from legend. His horse, streaked with sweat and dust, surged ahead in the final stretch. Every muscle strained, every heartbeat thundered. Then, with a final leap, The steed crossed the finish line. For a moment, silence, the kind that precedes a storm, and then the valley erupted in sound. The Illyrians roared, horns blared, and the green hills echoed with cheers that rolled like waves. The victor dismounted slowly, trembling with exhaustion. His horse, lathered with sweat, lowered its head as if bowing to the gods themselves. The priests approached, carrying wreaths of oak leaves and bronze circlets, symbols of strength and eternal memory. The champion's name was proclaimed by the heralds, shouted so loudly that the echoes reached even the most distant cliffs. Children ran forward to touch the horse, believing a fragment of its strength might pass to them. The defeated riders were not shamed. They were honoured too, for in Illyria, bravery mattered more than victory. Each man received a libation of wine, a pat on the shoulder, and his tribe's songs of praise. "The gods love those who race the wind," said the elders, "but they bless most the one who dares." Then came the celebration. The poets, the rhapsodes of the mountains, stood before the fire and sang. They recited verses crafted on the spot, turning the day's race into legend. Each verse told of the victor's courage, his tribe's honour, and the divine speed of his steed. Bronze upon his horse, sun upon his brow, he outran the wind and silenced the mountains, they sang, and the people joined in until the night itself seemed to hum with music. Feasts followed, of course, wine flowed again, and laughter returned to the camp. Some tribes offered gifts to the champion, fine cloaks, carved drinking horns, or even gold rings. Others simply raised their cups and toasted his name. As the fires burned low, an old priest whispered the words that closed every Illyrian festival. "Men may fade, horses may fall, but glory, glory runs forever." And somewhere, deep in the dark mountains, the echo of hooves seemed to answer. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the plains transformed once more, not into a battlefield of speed, but into a stage of celebration. The air that had been filled with the thunder of hooves now trembled with the sounds of lyres, drums, and laughter. Smoke from roasting boar drifted skyward, carrying with it the scent of victory. The great festival of the Illyrians had reached its second heartbeat, the Feast of Glory. The victorious rider, still dust-streaked and breathless, was led to the central fire. His horse followed beside him, draped in garlands of oak and bronze discs that shimmered under the flames. The priests raised their hands to the heavens, calling upon the gods to bless both man and beast. Wine was poured onto the ground as an offering, a libation to Medorus, to Vidasus and Thana, and to the nameless spirits who guarded the tribes. Then the feasting began. Long wooden tables overflowed with food. Roasted lamb glazed with honey, loaves of bread baked in clay, and cheeses wrapped in mountain herbs. Horns of mead passed from hand to hand, and every cup lifted was another toast to courage. The victor was seated beside the chieftains, a place of highest honour, and gifted a cloak woven with silver thread, a garment meant to last a lifetime, or at least as long as his legend did. Around the fires, poets and musicians began their work. They sang of the race, of the speed of the horses, and the bravery of the riders. But they also sang of the unity of the tribes, how for a few precious days Dardanian, Taulantian, and Enchelean stood together as one people. The music rose and fell like the wind through the passes, echoing into the night. Dancers joined in, circling the fires in rhythmic steps that mimicked galloping hooves. Bronze bracelets clinked, and torches swung in wide arcs that painted flames across the darkness. Even the elders smiled, remembering their own races of long ago. By midnight, the songs had turned softer, and the firelight flickered across tired faces. For the Illyrians, this night wasn't merely a celebration of victory. It was a renewal of spirit, a promise to meet again next year beneath the same stars, with the same wild hearts and untamed horses. As the night deepened, the festival entered its most sacred hour, the Night of Fires. Across the valley, Hundreds of flames flickered to life, spreading like constellations across the earth. Every tribe lit its own pyre, symbolizing both its independence and its bond to the greater Illyrian spirit. From the mountains, the scene looked like the heavens themselves had descended to dance upon the plains. The people gathered in circles around their fires, hands joined, faces glowing in the orange light. Chiefs spoke solemnly, invoking the names of ancestors, warriors, chieftains, and horsemen whose courage shaped the tribes. "We are many," they would say, "but the fire burns as one." It was a moment of rare peace among a people so often divided by pride and blood. As the flames crackled, young men and women performed the dance of the stallion, a ritual both playful and fierce. The men stomped and turned, mimicking horses rearing and racing, while the women twirled like ribbons of wind, their hair braided with silver strands to catch the firelight. Each movement told a story of birth, of battle, of endurance. The drums followed their rhythm, steady as the gallop of hooves, and the whole valley seemed to pulse with ancient energy. The priests of Medorus moved between the fires, casting herbs and salt into the flames. Sparks leapt upward like stars being reborn. They proclaimed that the gods had been pleased. The races had been brave, the offerings pure, the unity strong. Children laughed and reached for the sparks as if to catch a blessing. Then came the oldest ritual of all, the oath of the tribes. One by one, each chieftain stepped forward and touched a burning brand to the ground, swearing to defend their people and their land until the next festival. The fire that united them was a promise, one that could not be broken without shame. When the chants faded, silence returned, the comfortable silence of kinship, of shared breath under the same stars. The Illyrians knew that by morning they would scatter again to their mountain homes. But on this night, under the fire and the moon, they were not strangers or rivals. They were one people, wild, proud, and bound by flame and hoofbeat. When dawn crept back over the Illyrian mountains, the festival began to fade like a dream. The fires had burned down to embers, and a faint mist curled over the plain where laughter and song had ruled the night before. The smell of ash, wine, and trampled grass lingered in the air, the perfume of 1,000 memories. Slowly, the tribes began to break camp. Warriors packed their weapons, women gathered their children, and the once crowded field turned quiet again. But though the festival ended, its spirit lingered like the echo of hooves in the distance. The priests were the last to rise. They walked among the ashes of the great fires, collecting charred pieces of wood to carry back to their temples. Each ember was sacred, a spark of the unity the tribes had kindled together. They placed the glowing fragments in clay vessels, to be kept burning through the seasons, a promise that the tribes would meet again when the time of racing returned. The victors rode out first, leading their horses proudly through the thinning mist. Children ran alongside them, singing songs of their triumphs, while elders watched with eyes full of pride and melancholy. The green valleys swallowed them one by one, until only the faint glimmer of bronze from their horse gear remained in the distance. For the rest, departure was slower. Some lingered to trade goods, salt for grain, leather for wine, while others simply embraced their distant kin before returning to their mountain strongholds. No treaties were signed, no borders redrawn, but peace, however fragile, had been renewed through the ancient rhythm of the race. As the sun climbed higher, the last echo of drums faded. Only the hoofprints remained, thousands of them stamped deep into the soft earth. To the Illyrians, these marks were sacred, proof that the gods had walked among them in the form of horses. By evening, the wind would erase them, but not the memory. In the centuries that followed, when empires rose and fell over Illyria's hills, the songs of those races still survived. And somewhere in the mountains, when the thunder of hooves echoes between the rocks, the people say it's not the storm. It's the spirits of their ancestors, still racing for glory beneath the eternal sky.